Erno Goldfinger. The high point of Goldfinger's reputation as architect in his lifetime was probably January 1963, with the publication of the special edition of Architectural Design devoted exclusively to his work, with an introduction by Herbert Reed. It might now be asked what relevance his work still has in the very different conditions, both technically and socially, of today compared to 60 years ago. It has, in my opinion, still much to teach us, as I hope to demonstrate, concentrating on just the three themes represented by the images you see here, those of space, structure, and proportion. These are all key issues in his work, and ones that seem effectively absent from current discourse, which is why it's important to draw attention to them now. The drawing at top left is one he did for his 3 articles on the sensation of space, published in the Architectural Review in 1940-41. Below it is a detail from the last building built to his design, the Perry House at Windlesham in Surrey of 1968, representing his view that structure was truth, that buildings should express how they stand up and what material they are made of. And on the right is proportion or number, an extract from the January 1963 AD showing 3 proportional relations that he used really since the 1930s, based on the square, the √2 proportion, the 3:2 proportion, and the golden section. Above them is a diagram illustrating the 2-foot 9-inch grid or module, which is 11 inches times 3 or 3 inches times 11, which he used at least since the war, both in the vertical and horizontal plane. At the top, it is shown applied to ergonomics for kitchen design, something that interested him greatly. This is a good photograph to portray Goldfinger because design for children was something else that interested him all his life, and that probably brought him to this country in the first place through his connection to toy manufacturers Paul and Marjorie Abbott, not long after the birth of his own first child. You see him standing in front of the nursery school at the bottom of Trellick Tower, which he designed in detail, but which has sadly since closed. His design for children was an aspect of his concern with design for society as a whole, including their kitchens, which in turn I see as a manifestation of his concern with space. Space was fundamental to his design for social housing, where his objective was not that of just getting the maximum number of people onto any given site, the present philosophy, but that creating conditions of spatial freedom, conditions where, as he said, he would wish to live himself. Underneath is his diagram published in Paris in 1927, when he would have been 24-25 years old, in a magazine called Organisation Ménagère, Domestic Management, for which he was design consultant, illustrating the process by which a design or, quote, solution is generated. Its dialectical structure illustrates, I think, the analogy between his design thinking and his wider social and political outlook. He always said he was never a member of the Communist Party, but he was certainly entranced by the Hegelian or Marxian process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The needs and means can be put together almost mechanically with an infusion of economy to produce a solution. The corollary of that is that if either the needs or the means changed over time, then the solution changed too. So he was convinced that change was constant on the basis of that sort of dialectical process. He redrew the diagram 50 years later for Monica Pidgeon in a more subjective, less mechanical form, admitting the art of enclosing space into the mix, resulting not just in a, quote, solution, but in architecture. This slide is just to show you where he actually came from, which is quite interesting, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His parents came from the opposite ends of the Carpathians. The stretch between is now mostly part of Ukraine. His father came from Zakopane in the Tatra Mountains at the north end of the Carpathians, and his mother from Transylvania at the southern end, both from families that had interests in forests and forest products, and fairly well off. His mother was certainly Jewish. His father must have been, but he was not practicing, and I heard Erno once claiming that the surname could be of Saxon origin, not Jewish, meaning gold panna. Because Zakopane was incorporated into Poland when the empire was dissolved, he became Polish. So Erno too was Polish by nationality until 1947, though born in Budapest and raised in his early years on his mother's estate, which later became part of Romania, near a place called Neumarkt in Saxon German, but Târgu Mureș in Romanian and Maros-Vasarely in Hungarian. It is a polyglot part of the world, which, after the First World War, was found to have a small majority of Romanian speakers, so was incorporated into Romania, leading to continuing tension with the Hungarian speakers, such as Goldfinger's family, although they apparently spoke German at home. Zakopane was a notable place. An exhibition about it has just finished at the William Morris Gallery, because it was the centre of the Polish arts and crafts movement called New Poland. I don't know whether Goldfinger's father knew anything about it, but Goldfinger said that his first interest in architecture was aroused when his father commissioned a house from an architect to be built in Budapest, who gave his parents the munificent present of a copy of Das Englische Haus by Muthesius, still in the possession of Erno's son Michael Goldfinger, to educate them about architecture. In fact, the First World War intervened, so the house never got built, but Goldfinger said that it was seeing the multicoloured plans for it by this architect that made him want to be an architect. The Goldfingers left Budapest for Vienna during the short-lived Soviet regime of Béla Kun in 1919, and in 1920 Goldfinger arrived in Paris to stay with his mother's cousin to improve his French. He stayed in the city for 14 years. She was a member of the Bernheim family, who were leading art dealers, for Renoir, for example. So Erno was immediately introduced to the art world of Paris, and on second attempt he won admission to the Ecole des Beaux Arts to study architecture. So that's him there, top left image, next to the stovepipe in the teaching atelier of Léon Josely, architect and planner, author of the Barcelona Grid. Top right is Erno in mature years, for comparison, and below that is me in my red-headed days in Erno's office in 1974. Below left is Goldfinger's carte d'élève, his pupil's ID card at the École des Beaux Arts, describing him as a pupil of Monsieur Perret. I think the Ecole did a certain amount of teaching, but most of the design tuition was done by volunteers, similar to the AA's unit system, but unpaid. There were established ateliers, but students could set up new ateliers and invite admired figures to teach them, which was considered an honour. The cost of renting and heating the studio space was covered by the students. Léon Josely had retired, leaving Erno free to seek another maître d'atelier, and he joined a group of students who invited Le Corbusier to teach them at about the time of the first publication as a book of Vers une architecture. Le Corbusier said, "No, I teach by what I write and what I build. Ask Auguste Perret," the pioneer in the use of concrete, for whom Le Corbusier had himself worked. So that's what they did. Perret was delighted to be asked and agreed to teach them, making available to them part of the Palais de Bois, a wooden exhibition pavilion he had recently built. The only difficulty was that from the point of view of the Ecole, Perret, who had been a star pupil of them, had gone off the rails. Firstly, by leaving before getting his diploma. Secondly, by starting to use that horrible material concrete openly while working as a part of a firm of contractors. So the designs submitted by pupils from his atelier and showing his influence were systematically failed by the jury of the Ecole. Without approvals from the jury, you couldn't progress through the school and couldn't build up the required number of credits to obtain your diploma. So after about a year and a half, Perret's atelier had to be closed again, and its members dispersed to a number of conventional ateliers doing conventional designs, Goldfinger included. Just to deal with the James Bond aspect of the story before somebody else does, Goldfinger never met Ian Fleming, and there's no truth in the story that Fleming intended to damage him because he didn't like his architecture or anything like that. The dates just don't tie up. The connection is that Fleming used to play golf at the Royal St George's Golf Course in Sandwich, and so did Charles Blackwell, the cousin of Goldfinger's wife Ursula. So, through that cousin, Fleming heard the name Goldfinger. Fleming habitually used real people's names in his books and found it a convenient name to suggest someone exotic and potentially menacing. Gert Fröber as Fleming's Goldfinger is shown top left in the film playing golf with Bond, with Erno himself apparently posing as a Bond villain in the central image, and James Bond is back in 2003 at Trellick Tower. Believing in himself all his life, Erno kept everything that he did. The result is that there's a complete set of his drawings for the Ecole des Beaux Arts and other projects. The French found this very useful in about 1985 when they wanted to mount an exhibition of the Perret atelier because most of the other members had thrown away their work, but Erno had kept his. So you can see here on the left a student technical study of how to design the tower of a Romanesque cathedral and with a steel roof. An amazing piece of work. And on the right, a design for an architect's office with, Erno explained to me, large steel louvered windows of which he was very fond. Wouldn't it be nice if architects' offices were quite as serene as that? Perret had in 1903 designed this block in Passy left, which Pevsner was to describe as spatially the most advanced building in Europe of its time. It was the first concrete frame building where the frame is deliberately expressed in architectural terms, although here clad in terracotta. It was built as a development by the three Perret brothers, who were building contractors, a business inherited from their father, with Auguste as the designer. He was given to cryptic aphorisms, such as the one shown at top right. Architecture is the art of organizing space. It is through construction that it is expressed. Shown here as published in the 1952 collection, Contribution to a Theory of Architecture. It identifies space as the primary objective of architecture and construction or structure as the means to its expression, and this may be said to be a philosophy that inspired Goldfinger all his life. Below the aphorism is Perret's drawing of the structure for his theatre Théâtre des Champs-Élysées of 1912, on which Goldfinger set great store with its square grid and wished to use as a cover for his projected but unpublished book about Perret in the 1970s. This shows Erno's own student work from his time in the Perret atelier, alongside what Perret was building at the time, the observation tower at Grenoble in southeast France on the right. You can see that Goldfinger's projects pick up on this language. This is a reservoir at top with below it a shooting club, and both these projects were failed by the Ecole des Beaux Arts jury, showing how student projects showing the influence of Perret were simply failed. But while that was going on, Goldfinger was also doing other work. At top is a stunning project from 1927 for law courts in San Salvador, of all places. There was an international competition, and a set of concrete contractors employed Goldfinger and his then partner Andras Szivesi to submit on their behalf. Szivesi was a fellow Hungarian who subsequently simplified his name to André Sive, and who was to have quite a distinguished career of his own. The two of them produced this design, which in terms of spatial expression and force of structural framework is, I think, remarkable. The original drawings were sent over to San Salvador, so only the photographs of the drawings exist. He was also doing furniture designs like that below and getting the pieces made. He told me that as a student he was supported, unlike many students who had to work practically full-time in order to support themselves. But this stopped in 1930 with the slump, and from then on he had to support himself. And he was doing interior work. At right is a fit-out for a studio apartment in Paris for English author John Wyndham, including a desk of Erno's design, a beautifully made thing. These are swivel drawers. They don't pull out, they pivot. On the left is the Central European Travel Express office, using Plymax, which was a copper sheet-faced plywood with rivets. It is very austere, as you can see, very bare. But in order to pass the Beaux Arts exams, you had to do things like this. At right is his measured drawing of a medieval doorway at the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, which won him a prize. And at left is a design for a private mansion, again accepted by the jury, which is actually a fairly close copy of the Château of Vaux-le-Vicomte just outside Paris. But Goldfinger was not being totally cynical, and his interest in that building remained. Below is the French tourist office in London, which he did with Charlotte Perriand in 1963, where he put on the wall a huge blow-up of an aerial view of Vaux-le-Vicomte, which Ursula Goldfinger remembered that they often visited. He was friendly during this time with Adolf Loos, a fellow Austro-Hungarian, top left, who spent the 5 years in Paris from 1925 to 1930, where he built the house for Tristan Tzara in Montmartre, top right. Goldfinger visited the Tzara house under construction with Loos, and also the Art Décoratif exhibition of 1925, where he said he was most impressed by Le Corbusier's Esprit Nouveau pavilion, Melnikov's USSR pavilion, and the Japanese pavilion in the form of a traditional timber house, which he watched being assembled from meticulously wrapped pieces. His attempts to bring about a meeting of Loos and Perret was unsuccessful, but both were to exert influence for the rest of his life. In the case of Loos, with the richly veined marble and richly grained timber veneers combined with razor-sharp detailing, here reflected in Goldfinger's work, as is the complex play of levels in section, visible in the section of the Tzara house, which was a manifestation of Loos's round plan theory, space planning, whereby ceiling heights reflect room sizes, with the result that there are frequent steps in floor levels, generating a continuous spatial flow through the house. Similar steps in floor level can be seen in a number of houses designed by Goldfinger, including his own at Willow Road, where he acknowledged the influence of Loos. I mentioned earlier the magazine L'Organisation Ménagère, of which Goldfinger was design consultant, and where he published his emblematic needs and means diagram of the design process. Here is the cover he designed for them, and you will see that the fourth item in the contents list on the left of this issue of October 1928 is Les Sièges Rationnels, Rational Furniture, by Goldfinger and Sivasi. On the right is a typical diagram by Goldfinger illustrating design principles for kitchens from the same year. He was enthusiastic about the principles of Taylorism, the time and motion study methods applied by Ford to production line manufacture, and support to transfer its lessons to the domestic sphere. He also picked up some of the kitchen planning ideas of Margarita Schutter-Lihotzky's Frankfurt kitchen of 1925. It was during this time, in 1927 that he built in England for the first time. The salon for the famous Paris-based cosmetician Helena Rubinstein in Grafton Street, Mayfair. Top 2 images. Described by Paul Riley as the first modern shop in London, with its radiused end. It has a rather Mendelssohnian ring. Mendelssohn, incidentally, was someone else he knew. I noted him saying that Mendelssohn was a horrible man but a fabulous architect. It was destroyed in the war, but it was quite striking. He had a row with Helena Rubinstein when it was finished because she refused to pay his fees, because it was too modern. She seems to have thought he seemed a lively young man, gave him his head without really looking at the drawings, and was appalled when she saw the result. So then he hired Suzanne Blum, who subsequently became famous as the confidante of the Duchess of Windsor, and was then a young law student in Paris, to sue for his fees, which she did successfully. She was a client herself for at least 2 apartments. The lower image shows a kitchen which Goldfinger actually built for himself in one of his flats, using those condiment trays advocated by Schutter-Lehotzky, and sliding doors and shaped drawer fronts. His milieu was that of the artistic world. Top left is a photograph by Man Ray of himself with Picasso. Dora Maar, Senator and Madame Quetelet, and Adrienne, companion of the poet Paul Éluard. The Quetelets were leading clients of Goldfinger's at this time, and Man Ray was a friend. Through this artistic world, he also met his wife-to-be, Ursula Blackwell. That's the portrait of her by Man Ray in the top right corner. Very striking, actually. She was a student of painting in Paris who'd run away from her conventional county family to study art, unlike her sister, who came out as a debutante and attended balls, and so on. Ursula wanted to be an art student and went off to Paris, and subsequently became a pupil of Aux Enfants. That's a work of his, beneath her portrait, which belonged to the Goldfingers. Another great friend was Max Ernst, and that painting of his at bottom left, La Joie de Vivre of 1936, but belonged to the Goldfingers. The Quetelets were based in Algeria, in the city of Philippeville, now called Skidka. Paul Quetelet being a progressive local politician, Marie a fashion designer famous for stimulating the production of tapestries, first in Algeria, then in France, for the design of which she was to commission leading modern artists, including Picasso, Matisse, and Le Corbusier. Goldfinger went to Algeria for 6 months in 1929 to design various projects for them, including the housing, at top right, intended for the indigenous population, but showing awareness of some of Gropius's recent housing projects in Germany. There were also various projects for a hotel in Philippeville, of which the drawing on the left is one. This is exactly contemporary with a similar shaded white house designed by Le Corbusier for North Africa. But Goldfinger's structure is much more robust and apparently fair-faced, illustrating what he said was his arts and crafts belief that constructional materials should be expressed, unlike in Le Corbusier's white architecture of this period. The monument underneath, to a General Luteau, who was again a hero of the left wing in Algeria, was the only thing to be built. This is another photo by Man Ray of Ursula Blackwell, top left, with Goldfinger by Illa, there in the middle with his heliometer of 1931. This is typical of his research interests. It was a calibrated mobile table that he designed on which you could position an architectural model and tilt it in relation to a fixed light source, so that for any part of the world you could see exactly where the shadows would fall at any time of the day or the year. In 1932, he and his wife-to-be travelled around the newly completed coastal road around Spain, and he also gave a lecture in the University of Madrid entitled Architecture et l'activité humaine, for which he designed this invitation showing an écorché human figure superimposed on his diploma project at the Ecole des Beaux Arts, for which he had finally graduated in 1931. In 1933, he was secretary of the French Siam group and as such attended the famous floating conference that went to Athens on board ship. That is a photograph on the left of him standing in front of the columns of the Parthenon on that occasion, when he also exhibited for the first time his design for what was effectively a unité d'habitation, a communal housing unit on the right, complete with nursery school on the roof. So it's about 15 years before the version by Le Corbusier, who was, of course, at this conference. Goldfinger's earliest drawings for it date from 1931. He was also active in left-wing politics and a member of an organisation called Association des écrivains et artistes révolutionnaires, to which many of the surrealists belonged, and also Charlotte Perriand. This is his authorization on the left to represent them under pseudonym of Pierre, actually the name of his first son, born in 1933, a month or two after his marriage to Ursula Blackwell, at the International Anti-Fascist Conference of 1934. Under the auspices of the AEAR, he designed this monument on the right to Albert Perdreau, a strike leader who had been assassinated, which was actually built. In 1933, he had mounted an exhibition of the life of Karl Marx in Melnikov's USSR pavilion, which had been rebuilt in Villejuif. In 1934, he also did his totally plywood-lined apartment for his old lawyer friend, Maître Suzanne Blum, in the Rue de Varennes, with a plywood spiral stair, which I saw in the 1980s and met his client, who was still living there. I took these photos myself. At age 32, he also completed his first freestanding building, the studio visible on the right at The Outlook, an arts and crafts house at Cuques, near Le Touquet, which he also radically altered. It was built, I think, originally for the keeper of the nearby Étaples war cemetery designed by Lutyens. This again is a photograph of mine from the 1980s, after some subsequent alterations, but the monopitch roof, the windows and the precast surrounds, the precast concrete spiral stair, the expressed brickwork, all themes in Goldfinger's later work, can be seen. Erno and Ursula got married in Paris in 1933, about a month before their first child, Peter, was born, in the UK for nationality reasons, with the second name Gordon apparently so that he could drop his inherited surname if he so wished, but retain the same initials. And at the end of 1934 they moved to London. Erno got on famously with his brother-in-law, Anthony Blackwell, pictured top left, who was an aspirant Conservative parliamentary candidate. Quite a lot of correspondence survives with Anthony, who seems to have really regarded Erno with a certain amount of awe as a man who really knew the world, unlike himself, who'd had a very sheltered upbringing. But he had it in mind that he would do property developments on the landed estate near Watford, owned by the Blackwells, to which he was heir. Goldfinger did a number of designs for buildings to be built on it, as illustrated top right, but none was ever built, and Blackwell was then killed in a military accident in the war, bringing that relationship to a close. The other relationship, I think, that brought the Goldfingers over was with the couple at the bottom left, Paul and Marjorie Abbott, shown rather later in life. They were famous as advanced toy manufacturers and preferred a pure form wooden toys to Steiff-type stuffed teddy bears. Erno, having a young son by this stage of his own, had become very interested in toys and everything to do with children, and even while he was still in Paris he was designing for the Abbotts, including fitting out a factory for them in Fitzrovia in collaboration with FRS York. This, at bottom right, is a design for the Nursery Schools Association, another body with which the abbots were closely involved. It has a kind of grandeur not often found in nursery schools, but also found in many of his designs, sometimes in collaboration with Mary Crowley, for wartime temporary structures such as holiday camps and evacuation centres. So he designed a lot of toys for the abbots and their catalogue, and also their shop or showroom, which is in Wimpole Street. It embodied all his ideas, a sophisticated piece of design. The opening is in proportion a 2:3 rectangle, and the window and door behind the steel I-beam are double squares, and the frontage was set back from the street line to create a calm space. A triple square on plan, in which you could stand to look at the display in the window without obstructing people walking along the pavement, something Goldfinger always tried to achieve in other shops. There was a minimalist, hard-edged elegance throughout. He claimed that this was the first example of a door handle that went the full height of a glass door like that. The recess and the I-beam are all that remain today. All the images on this screen show Abbott products designed by Goldfinger, including the wooden numbers that can be lifted out of their tray at bottom left, and the display of Abbott products in the children's section of the British Pavilion at the 1937 Paris International Fair at top left. On the strength of the relationship with the Abbotts, he was regarded as the expert on design for children, also designing the children's section of the 1938 London exhibition of the Mars Group, in which he was active. He went on to design a house for the Abbotts in 1939-40, which I am showing here out of chronological sequence because it relates to the Abbott story, though it ought to come after the next two projects I will show. The Abbotts wanted to move their manufacturing out of High Wycombe because of the threat of war, and they decided to build a house for themselves nearby. The onset of war made that impossible, and the only drawing of Goldfinger's that survives of his design for them is the one at the top left. But I managed to find enough material from trade sources to recreate the whole design, so the other two drawings are by me. It is interesting as the final gasp of the pre-war era, using the sloping site to create multiple levels and room heights internally in the round plan manner, and deploying externally a highly articulated structure of brick piers and even flint, a long way from the white architecture that in some quarters was still regarded as the signature modern finish. 4 years earlier, Goldfinger had managed to build this tiny little one-bedroom studio bungalow at Broxted in Essex, now right under the flight path to Stansted Airport. It came to him as a job through his assistant Gerald Flower and was built for an artist and landscape designer Humphrey Waterfield, who had already laid out the garden, creating a framework within which Goldfinger had designed the house. A neighbour's objections prevented construction of an earlier two-storey design with monopitch roofs, and the final single-storey flat roof design was as low as possible so as not to appear on the neighbour's sightline. The fall in the ground was used to create higher ceilings in the studio and living room, with a round plan-like step in the floor. The house is approached through a secretive door in a blank brick wall, from which a covered walkway crosses an enclosed courtyard open towards the garden, a spatial ambiguity that Goldfinger once mentioned to me as possibly surrealist. The pinwheel plan of the house, perhaps influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, in whom Goldfinger was also interested at that time, is built up from a series of squares. The large inglenook fireplace, complete with a little window, has an opening that is a double golden section in proportion, set in a ply-faced chimney breast of the same proportion. This is 1936, 12 years before publication of Le Corbusier's Modulo, showing that Goldfinger's interest in proportion is not dependent on that. Both were arguably dependent on Perret, with whom both had studied. A crude second story was later built on top of this house. Goldfinger's most important pre-war built work was undoubtedly the three houses he built in 1938-9 in Willow Road, Hampstead, the central one for his own occupation. His wife, Ursula Blackwell, was his client. She had come to him to design her an apartment in Paris with some inherited money, tightly controlled by trustees, but they ended up coming to London and building a house together. After a lot of searching, Erno had found a site overlooking Hampstead Heath with 3 small cottages on it, one being for sale, and had bought out the other 2. The original intention for the site had been to build a 6-storey block of studio apartments, quite literally 4 artists, but this was disallowed by the planners. Planning consent was won instead for 3-storey with basement terrace houses, despite controversy over their flat-roofed modern design, albeit brick-faced. Apparently Adolf Loos had told Erno, "You've got to look at Georgian terrace houses when you're in London because they're a model," and his office was indeed in Bedford Square at this time, in the house on the left in the right-hand image. Willow Road was an attempt to pick up on that. Classically, the 3 houses are treated as a single composition in elevation, to the point that it is sometimes not realised that there are 3 rather than 1. The central house for the Goldfingers' own occupation is a pure rectangle in plan and a square on elevation, with the outer houses picking up the irregular angles of the flanking boundaries of the site, as shown at the bottom left. All 3 houses are planned around a central top-lit spiral staircase, with a void in the middle, open concrete treads being cantilevered inwards from the surrounding concrete drum. The houses are largely of concrete construction behind their brick facing, as shown top right, which permits the long span in the central house from party wall to party wall. A central stair with rooms wrapped round it was an important principle for Goldfinger, a means of minimising circulation space, and was later to influence the layout of the flats in Balfron and Trellick Towers. He admired Palladio's Villa Rotunda because of its central top-lit drum with the rooms wrapped round it. You will see the windows are squares in proportion, or multiples of squares. The living room is a double square on plan, and the main rooms in section are variously square or 2 to 3 or golden section. The lower ceiling height required over the ground floor garages permits a round plan-like step in the first floor, generating a higher ceiling height in the north-facing front rooms, one of which was intended as a studio for Ursula Blackwell, with a dais for a model at the rear. But Loos-like flush oak veneered ply panelling in the living room, with minimal detailing, see bottom right, can be folded right back so as to open the entire first floor into a single space. The facade is highly articulated spatially, with projecting garages at each end, see photo top left, and some windows recessed above a deep horizontal plane at the first floor door head height, the so-called photobolic screen. The idea was that light was reflected off the top of it onto the ceiling internally, while at the same time moderating exposure to light and sun immediately adjacent to the window. Within weeks of the Goldfingers moving in, from High Point 1, and now with 2 children, the Second World War broke out, so hopes of capitalising professionally on the successful completion of the Willow Road houses had to be set aside for the duration. But Erno was asked by J.M. Richards, a near neighbour in Downshire Hill and acting editor of the Architectural Review, to write 3 articles about his theory of architectural space. This is the opening page of the first one. The little drawings show 3 types of enclosure: complete non-enclosure, moderate enclosure, and complete enclosure, such as either in a coffin or a plaster cast. The second page of that first article shows various other spatial phenomena that he proposes to examine in a systematic scientific way. His final sentence, however, illustrated by Piranesi engraving, is, When space is enclosed with the skill of an artist, when the purpose is to move, then spatial sensation becomes spatial emotion, and enclosed space becomes architecture. The word architecture being in capital letters. There is no time to examine the articles in detail here, but they were quite widely known, and they do highlight many of the issues, urban as well as architectural, that were to continue to preoccupy him. Goldfinger spent much of the war creating exhibitions for ABKA, the Army Bureau of Current Affairs. As a Polish national, he was not interned. All the services had educational programs to keep the troops informed and amused. Goldfinger contributed this by preparing exhibitions in the form of about 24 printed boards covering current topics, many but not all related to design or the built world, such as traffic or planning your kitchen, see top left and right, or planning your neighbourhood, or health centres, but also the film industry, and these were sent out to army or navy camps or quarters around the world where they could be pinned up on a vertical surface. They were definitely painting a picture of the better planned world that could be expected once the war was won, and hence contributed to the great Labour electoral victory in 1945. Some of these exhibitions are jointly credited to Ursula Blackwell, but it seems that this was mainly window dressing, to provide a more English-sounding name, though she was actively involved in something called the Women's Parliament. He did, however, sometimes work with the illustrator Gordon Cullen. It is not always clear to me who did the drawings, but I think, for example, that on the cover page for Traffic is by Goldfinger. One of the London exhibitions he was asked to put on was 25 Years of Soviet Progress, after he had put on an earlier exhibition devoted to the Eastern Front. This was in 1942, after the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union and it had become our ally, a great relief to left-leaning intellectual sympathisers such as himself. That's the entrance ticket to it, and the cover design for a prospective book, bottom left and right. Also in 1942, the Goldfingers put on a celebrated fundraising art exhibition in Willow Road of the work of all their modern artist friends called Aid to Russia. One of the most successful exhibitions he did, which he followed up by writing jointly with E.J. Carter, a widely sold book, was on the County of London Plan, produced in 1942 by the celebrated planner Patrick Abercrombie, who was a friend of his, and J.H. Forshaw, architect to the LCC. Top right is the cover of the book. Goldfinger also did studies for what post-war housing would be like. Top left is an illustration of the Green City idea with 12-storey freestanding Y-shaped cross-wall blocks set in a continuous parkland, as seen from inside, looking out. He worked with Avi Arab on the structural aspects of cross-wall construction. By the end of the war in 1945, Goldfinger was 43 and had not yet built very much. He had built the Willow Road houses, the studio in Cuke, and the little studio house at Broxted, and that's all, apart from interiors. After the war, however, there was much government-funded reconstruction to be done, and his left-wing connections proved useful. On the left is his frontage for the Communist Party headquarters in Covent Garden, rebuilt after war damage, and on the right the Daily Worker building in Clerkenwell, 4 floors rebuilt on top of 2 retained floors of a bomb-damaged building. Goldfinger characteristically studied newspaper production with great care, producing a great many diagrams to illustrate and justify his novel proposals for it here. Both buildings have been demolished, as has also been a contemporary warehouse in Birmingham. After the war, the spirit of internationalism, which was part of the left-wing agenda, led him to co-found the International Union of Architects with Pierre Vagot, who had been a fellow member of the Perret Atelier, as a successor to the defunct Réunion Internationale des Architectes. This was in London, and Perret was invited to be honorary president. with Goldfinger's friend Patrick Abercrombie as first executive president. At top left you see Goldfinger and Vago standing behind Perret at the inauguration in 1946. And below it you see Abercrombie speaking at the RIBA with Perret next to him and Goldfinger on the far side. I must say I don't know how Goldfinger found time for this on top of his other numerous activities at this time. On the right is the cover of a 1932 edition of the magazine Architecture d'aujourd'hui, devoted to promotion of the ideals of Perret. It was founded in 1930 by André Bloch, engineer, artist and sculptor, with involvement by Le Corbusier, Mallet, Stevens and Perret, and it was to play quite a large part in Goldfinger's life. There was a division in Paris between the followers of Le Corbusier and those of Perret, a distinction which I have characterized as being between idealists and rationalists. Perret's work is characterized as structural rationalist because it expresses or articulates its structure, unlike Le Corbusier's white architecture of that time, with its plainer, rendered external surfaces. The difference was also strongly marked in the proportions of windows, Le Corbusier aspiring to the horizontal fenêtre en longueur, offering optimal light and view and compatible with a weightless facade. Perret insisting on a vertical format since, quotes, a window is a man, which was also more compatible with his facades expressing their structural framework. Goldfinger effectively aimed to straddle both positions and quoted to me a student ditty of the time: Horizontal oder vertikal der Minimax der Stubeale. Minimax was a kind of fire extinguisher. Either horizontal or vertical, the Minimax puts them all out. Of course, at Willow Road there was a pronounced fenêtre en longueur right across at first floor level, but constructional materials are expressed, brick, concrete, timber, without any rendering such as was still widely considered to be modern. On the left is a portrait of André Bloch, who set up L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, of which Goldfinger became the London correspondent, unpaid, when he moved to London. So it was his role to send to Paris in architectural projects of interest built and published in the UK, a role that he continued to fulfill until after Bloch's death in 1966. In that way, he kept contact with a lot of architects in the UK whose work he found of note, such as the Smithsons and Sterling, asking them for material he could send to Paris. André Bloch later himself went on to build in the 1960s these extraordinary arcuated brick structures, which he called sculpture habitacle on the right. Are they sculpture? Are they architecture? I think that Goldfinger worried a bit. Anthony Caro was later to coin the term sculptecture to describe his own sculptures of architectural scale, but Bloch's are more architectural. When Bloch died, Goldfinger wrote his obituary for the Times. In 1951, Bloch established the Groupe Espace. This is my translation of its published manifesto, which, with a selected list of signatories under the three headings of architects, constructors and plastic artists, plasticiens. As you'll see, Bloch is one of the plastic artists listed at the bottom. The objective was to promote a synthesis of the arts and involve plastic artists in the reconstruction of France with a view to enhancing its architectural quality, specifically to bringing the values of abstract art into design. Its demands include, quotes, an art that takes its place in real space, that corresponds to functional necessities and all the needs of man from the most basic to the most elevated, with a concluding demand in uppercase text for the harmonious development of all human activities, the fundamental presence of plastic values. Architect signatories included Gevrekian, Arne Jacobsen, Richard Neutra, Lubetkin's former partner Jean Gainsbourg, and Goldfinger's former partner André Sive, but not Goldfinger himself. However, correspondence shows that he was in touch with the group continuously from the beginning. Other non-signatories who were nevertheless officers included Fernand Léger and Georges Candilis. Constructors include Jean Prouvé and Robert Le Ricolet, Louis Kahn's engineer, and plasticiens included the abstractionists Jean Gorin, Berto Lardera, and Victor Vasarely. It was the group Espace's desire to bring visual artists into the architectural project that lay behind the famous This Is Tomorrow exhibition in London of 1956, considered by Banham and others to have launched pop art. I am not sure why it was to be in London, but Bloch encouraged Paul Vézelay, artist member of the pre-war Abstraction Création group, who had forged her career in Paris but returned to her native England and was a member of the group Espace, to promote an exhibition that would bring a painter, a sculptor and an architect together in teams of 3 to propose their vision of the future. Trouble soon broke out, and the rather ethereal abstract concept of the group Espace and its involvement as an organisation was ditched by the more aggressive, pop-oriented UK participants, who followed the basic concept but set up their own show at the Whitechapel Gallery, leaving Vézelay with a small rump that exhibited courtesy of Leslie Martin in the Festival Hall, image bottom left. This is referred to in the catalogue. See the text by Lawrence Alloway highlighted in pink, which reads, "This is Tomorrow, developed out of a proposal to hold an exhibition organised on the lines of orthodox integration recommended by La Groupe Espace in Paris. The English artists and architects would not submit to the domestic ideas of synthesis held by La Groupe Espace." Goldfinger was left as the only actual member of the Group Espace who went with the Whitechapel group, alongside friends from the Institute of Contemporary Art and the independent group with which he had also been involved. He teamed up with painter Victor Pasmore and the sculptor Helen Phillips, the wife of Stanley Hayter, his Parisian printmaker friend. These are his sketches for his pavilion, which of course was a square in plan and a double square in section, based on a 2-foot module. It celebrated the theme of human scale, with varying degrees of enclosure and view out. The first phase accommodating 2 reliefs by Victor Pasmore that appear to harmonise with his architecture, the second with a hanging sculpture by Phillips which contrasts with it. Goldfinger's new text, entitled The Sensation of Space, and starting, "A particle is snatched from space, rhythmically modulated by membranes dividing it from surrounding chaos. That is architecture," was published in the catalogue. At this sort of scale, he went on to work with Charlotte Perriand and these various showrooms for the French Tourist Office in London. Haymarket, top right, 1959, Piccadilly, top left, 1963, and also for the French Railways in the Champs-Élysées, below, 1967. He made interesting play with lettering in both cases, with the sheer glass frontages recessed, as with the Abbot shop, and with their very hard edge minimal detailing and pivoting flush panelling internally. The SNCF showroom in Paris used a water-filled steel structure several years before that used in the Pompidou Centre. The flat reflective hardness of the glass was offset by moulded timber handles and fine slate and granite surfaces, with signs set at floor level behind the glass, as Norman Foster was to do some 20 years later. In 1956, construction also started on one of the most significant new buildings in the development of his career, the rebuilding as offices above showrooms of numbers 49 to 50 Albemarle Street, a bomb site in Mayfair. Number 50 belonged to Mason Pearson, a hairbrush manufacturer who had also had business involvement with the Communist Party, and it was through this that Goldfinger got the job for one half of the site. He proposed that the owner of the other half be approached with a view to doing a joint project. This was property developer Arnold Lee, who was to play a major part in his later career. so the two distinct sites were designed as a single project without any suggestion of the dual ownership, showing, as at Willow Road. Within this predominantly brick Georgian street, Goldfinger proposed a concrete frame structure clad in Portland stone and topped by a floating feature that he termed a cornice. The plane of the facade is recessed to allow for the 6 full stories within permitted light angles. There are further recesses at clerestory level on each floor above photobolic screens, and bay windows cantilevered forwards on 2 levels across the central party wall line. The facade as a whole is thus highly spatially articulated. Proportionally, it is based on 2 to 3 rectangles, with the typical repeated window being a square. The structural frame is powerfully expressed on elevation, with horizontals and verticals being the same width. Curtain walls, such as were common at the time, were anathema to Goldfinger because they obscured the structure. He once compared them to, quotes, the stockings that burglars wear. The cornice on the skyline was also canonical and to reappear in subsequent projects. He was insistent that a facade, like a classical column, should have a base, a shaft, and a capital. All are present here. Lewis Mumford praised the design in New Yorker for its harmony with the character of the street. Goldfinger projected designs using a similar language for other sites, such as these 2 on the corner of Dover Street and Piccadilly on the left, and for a shopping centre in Chester on the right. Neither were built. But what did get built was one of the largest office developments of its time at the Elephant and Castle, South London. It was a low-budget development in a low-budget area, let before construction began in 1958 to the government for use as the Ministry of Health and named Alexander Fleming House, the first minister to occupy it being Enoch Powell. Goldfinger was successful with Arnold Lee, his client from Albemarle Street, in a design developer competition run by the London County Council, LCC, apparently with some massaging by them in his favour of Lee's financial offer. Lee proposed to Goldfinger that they go in for it, to which he agreed, he told me, on condition that his fee was paid, whatever the outcome. Fortunately, Lee agreed to do so because this was his major break. By this time, Erno was 55. The design comprised 5 blocks of cumulative height around a central courtyard, together with a new Odeon cinema. On the right is a photograph by Goldfinger of the tallest block soon after completion, showing the powerful exploitation of the motif of the bay window and recessed story within an expressed structural frame derived from Albemarle Street. This time, however, the concrete frame is bush-hammered, not clad in Portland stone, and the bay windows are built off the cantilevered floor slabs, not off a light steel structure set within the frame. The result is a greater sense of mass. On the left are photos of the whole composition that I took in the 1970s. Still a student at Cambridge, I went to Elephant and Castle before I applied to work for him, Goldfinger. I'd heard that he'd built something there, but had no idea what. This building confronted me when I came out of the tube station, and I was in no doubt it must be his. It seemed so vibrant in its textures and massing. Lower right is the plan showing the 4 principal blocks in echelon, arranged symmetrically about a north-south axis, with the cinema upper right and the little pub block lower right, and the 16-foot 6-inch square planning grid running throughout, which is 6 times the standard 2-foot 9 inches or 840mm module. Above is the principal west elevation. The tallest block is in proportion 2 horizontal golden section rectangles stacked vertically, and the axial block is 2 vertical golden section rectangles stacked horizontally, a proportion mirrored by the upper part of the small pub block in front of it. The standard bay dimensions are within 1% of golden section. The division of the facades into 5-storey elements by a pattern of projections and recesses reflects Goldfinger's belief that 5 storeys was the typical inner London building height, which established a module, and if repeated, it would tie his building to others around it. He was more contextual in his approach than might be imagined. The engagement which these blocks have with the space around them, due to their highly articulated facades and to features such as the open cornice at roof level, with stair towers projecting and rising further still, is to me stunning. On the left are images of the exterior and interior of the cinema, the largest built post-war, with its innovative Y-shaped roof structure framing the paths of light from the suspended projection room. The image on the right is of the Gazprom, or House of State Industry in Kharkiv, Ukraine, completed in 1927 and published in detail in Architecture Vivante in Paris at that time. Its cumulative composition and architectural character suggested it to me as a source for Alexander Fleming House a long time ago, something which Goldfinger denied. Possibly any similarity is rather due to the classically derived axial composition, quite widespread between the wars, which Goldfinger brought forward. The image on the left shows the coloured glass screens in the entrance lobbies, on which Goldfinger collaborated with Kenneth Rowntree, and the coffered ceilings and minimal tube light fittings. This slide shows typical details, including the coffered ceilings at ground level, the minimal tube lights, sheer frameless plate glass screens, moulded timber door handles, and the crisp granite cladding of the columns at this level. Further details: the splendid lettering for the cinema on the left, each letter a plane intersecting with the curved facade, and on the right one of the glazed screens of the bridges linking the different blocks. Goldfinger regarded this as his greatest work. Once I was asked to write an entry about him for the Macmillan Dictionary of Art, and they allowed me just one illustration. Goldfinger said it should be of the Elephant and Castle. But its fate has not been good. Only the last of the 4 larger blocks was air-conditioned, the others being exposed with opened windows to the noise and pollution of a major traffic roundabout on one side and a railway on the other. In the early 1980s, these blocks were covered in an experimental mesh designed to tackle the environmental issues, but also obscuring the architecture. Many fell off, and they were all removed when the government's 25-year lease expired in 1984. After a number of years vacant, the concrete was painted white and the spandrel panels blue as part of a low-budget conversion to residential, which fortunately retained the original windows. At about the same time, 1988, the cinema was preemptively demolished while under consideration for listing, its site now being occupied by a new residential tower which upsets Goldfinger's cumulative composition and crudely imitates aspects of his architectural detail. After surviving with considerable damage a period when a certificate of immunity from listing applied, it benefited from Ed Vaizey's brief tenure of minister, responsible for listed buildings, to get listed, apart from the vital little corner block that was being further damaged as a result, and was again refused listing when I renominated. This was not historic England's finest hour, but something of value survives overall. At about the same time, Alexander Fleming House was getting off the ground with its coloured glass entrance hall screens. Goldfinger designed an entire house, top picture, or rather 2 maisonettes that were to be covered with them. By this stage they were entirely his own work, without Rowntree collaboration. This was to be in the Vale of Health in Hampstead. Of course, the planners thought it too awful for words and turned it down. There was an appeal. Eventually, consent was won, but by that time the clients had had to move on, so it didn't get built. Another triumph for our planning system. It was an amazing design, I think. At the same time, he was doing things like these below, which can be seen in Willow Road, painted pebbles and stones, a bit like the Max Ernst that he already had, but the idea of a foot being like that is picked up in his design for the door handles. All the door handles at the Elephant and Castle follow this moulded pattern, which he had made specially. It shows he could design with curves too. Now we reach the last phase of Goldfinger's career. He was 60. The LCC, it seems, must have been pleased with the outcome of the Elephant and Castle competition that they had managed, and he had backers there, which may have included Michael Powell, brother of Philip Powell of Powell and Moyer, but perhaps also Evelyn Dennington. Though he was disappointingly not successful with his ambitious pop art entry in the competition of 1960 for the adjacent Elephant and Castle shopping centre, where the winning Boissevain and Osmond design has just been demolished to be replaced by an Allies and Morrison design, in 1962 he was offered a housing site in Poplar, the first of 3 on peripheral sites around the already present Brownfield estate, known as Rowlett Street Phases 1, 2 and 3. The brief for the first envisaged 3 15-storey point blocks. These he combined into this single 26-storey slab block, Balfron Tower, seen on the left. Construction spanned from 1965 to 68. His design echoed in its overall size and proportion his communal housing unit of 1933, with its vertical circulation at one end, but its detachment from the main block and distribution from there and the section of the flat's layout were quite different, and picked up an unbuilt proposal he had made in 1956 for housing in Abbots Langley, Hertfordshire. Architecturally, the language owes something to Le Corbusier's Algiers Quartier de la Marine skyscraper project of 1938, especially the row of pulpit balconies across the middle, reflecting a row of larger maisonettes. The free-floating cornice, articulating the skyline, as at Albemarle Street, will be noticed, as well as the 4 chimney flues from the projecting boiler house at the top of the circulation tower. Originally, these were to have been flush and concealed within the tower, but when Goldfinger was offered another housing site adjacent, see the axonometric drawing on the right, showing his subsequent 11-storey Carradale house, it was decided to combine the heating scheme for both, calling for an increase in boiler size. These now needed to project, giving rise to a feature that Goldfinger was to exploit for expressive purposes twice later. The in-situ expressed concrete crosswall structure is bush-hammered with fine margins, not shutter-boarded. The detachment of the circulation tower, within which are the rubbish chutes, allows collection vehicles on the service road to make a complete loop around it. The drama of the 26-storey slab is considerable, though it contains just 146 dwellings, and Goldfinger was not unaware of the impact it would make when approached end-on from the nearby Blackwall Tunnel. The consolidation of the 3 blocks in the brief into a single block 70% taller avoided the repetition of identical blocks which Goldfinger abhorred. Eyebrows were certainly raised at the time about its proposed height, which nowadays appears quite modest with Canary Wharf nearby, but the LCC's chief architect, Hubert Bennett, supported it, so it got through. The 2 images on the left show the 1956 Abbots Langley project, for which the circulation pattern was first worked out, with an access gallery on every 3rd floor, serving, via ingeniously interlocking stairs, a dual-aspect 4-person flat on the floors above and below, and a 2-person flat on the floor adjacent, as can be seen on the plans of Balfron Tower on the right. That means you get 3 apartments for every structural bay, a very efficient planning arrangement compared to other schemes which were exploring this kind of arrangement at the time, inspired by Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, which managed no more than 2. Park Hill, with its streets in the sky on every 3rd floor, for example, has just 2 flats per structural bay, as does the Unité d'Habitation itself. The block faces east-west, and there is also a stack of larger 6-person flats facing due south, so there are 18 front doors on each access gallery. It is naturally lit and ventilated, but with the high parapets and louvers above, feels like an internal space. Goldfinger did see it as a street in the air, asking that residents of the cleared streets should be rehoused street by street. It was a space where street life, meetings and conversations could take place, as also were the lift lobbies, which are a story and a half high because the lift tower is divided into 2 stories for every 3 in the main block. The alternative floors to the lift lobbies house a variety of social rooms for laundry and hobbies, as well as occasionally tank rooms. There is a stair at both ends of the access gallery, Goldfinger insisting that 2 staircases were essential for safety in such buildings, something the government seems only very recently to come to acknowledge following the Grenfell disaster. On completion, Erno and Ursula Goldfinger were famously allowed to move into the top flat at the southern end for 2 months to try out the experience of living there on themselves, Ursula making extensive notes recording the comments of other new residents in the block. As their tenure was ending, the system-built Ronan Point tower block partially collapsed nearby after a gas explosion, an event sometimes said to have brought the era of high-rise social housing to an end. Erno was swiftly on the scene. The whole of the interior of Balfron was sadly stripped out recently by the developers who acquired this block. The east facade was reconfigured, all the substantial timber windows replaced in narrow bronzed aluminium, and the cornice and chimneys replaced in white concrete, all with Historic England consent despite its Grade 2 style listing. There remains 1 access gallery for every 3rd floor with associated stairs, but every flat has been made open plan. The block itself has a double square built into its facade, as you can see on the drawing on the right. On the left is a view looking south towards Balfron through Phase 2 Carradale House, which uses the detached circulation tower with links going to both sides. Goldfinger split Carradale into 2 so that nobody had to look due south at the blank north wall of Balfron. That was important to him. He said to me once when standing in the window of his house at Willow Road, looking out over Hampstead Heath, that the most important thing about a house is the view from its windows. That is also linked to his idea of space and to the idea of the green city, and it is fundamental to his approach to housing design. That is why he built tall buildings, not to cram more people in, but to give them better conditions inside, a better outlook and more spatial freedom. I would like to do an exhibition on this theme to be called Inside Looking Out. There was a 3rd phase at Rowlett Street, including 14-storey Glenkerry House, visible at right, and the photograph at top left, with Balfron and Carradale to the left of it. I was job architect for this 3rd phase while it was being built on site. The 3 taller buildings of contrasting mass but similar detail from the 3 phases form together a very satisfactory and carefully judged composition with, I would say, a romantic skyline, though each phase was designed without knowledge that there was to be another to follow. On the right is a detail of the north wall of Glenkerry House, showing the slit windows that light the stairs and the social or technical spaces, here as in the other blocks, and also the pattern of horizontal recessed joint lines marking each pore of the concrete. The windows were vertical pivots, leaving only narrow gaps so that nobody could fall out of them. So you get this exciting formal combination of the horizontal divisions of the daywork joints with the narrow verticals of the windows. You can also see the radiused corners of the concrete that certainly softens what might otherwise be an excessively hard effect. The 3rd phase also comprised a row of smaller buildings going along Bircham Street, built with calcium silicate bricks, also with radiused corners, shown bottom left. While Goldfinger was living at the top of Balfron Tower, he was working on the design for what was effectively to be his last project, the so-called Cheltenham or Edenham estate in North Kensington, including Trellick Tower, seen on both these images, for the Greater London Council, GLC. Such blocks were controversial when they were proposed, especially in Kensington and Chelsea, but Hubert Bennett, now GLC architect, was able to force it through. Essentially similar in format to Balfron Tower, but 5 stories taller, Trellick embodies a lot of refinements, including a cross-wall spacing that is 11 inches, 280 millimetres wider, and continuous balconies across the south front, which are also a feature of the contemporary Carradale houses. Both face south. The circulation tower is in this case rotated through 90 degrees as compared to Balfron to allow it to serve a second 7-story block above a row of shops, including latterly Goldfinger's own office, Block B, at right angles to the main block. Block A. There was intense pressure to get it out to tender before the imposition of the government's new housing cost yardsticks, which would have made it unfeasible. As can be seen on the right-hand image, the overall proportion of the main block is now double square, with 4 superimposed golden section rectangles that can be inserted within it. The cantilevered boiler house at the top of the circulation tower, an afterthought at Balfron, is here given its full expressive potential, described by Martin Richardson in the Architect's Journal as a cyclopean eye. Overall, the density of the estate is quite low at 130 persons per acre, and there are generous green spaces and 2 6-story blocks and 2 streets of 3-story terrace houses. That's the main entrance on the right with the club room above it, the social room for the entire block, a trace of the communal ideas that lie behind its design, with its lovely steel windows with curved glass around the corner, all of which have been taken out and replaced with thick plastic chamfered glass across the corner. In the entrance hall facing you is one of Goldfinger's coloured glass screens built up on his 11-inch module, top left. It is reminiscent of one of Van Doesburg's De Stijl or constructivist designs. All that coloured glass was taken out by the council about 15 years ago, smashed, drilled through in order to let more light into the entrance lobby after they had replaced the original plate glass entrance doors with heavy, largely opaque hardwood doors. Fortunately, the chairman of the Unconsulted Residents Association was aghast and managed to raise enough money to put the coloured glass back again, with which I helped her. By then, the original glass manufacturers were no longer in business, so the match is not exact. Prior to that, the council introduced a new electric heating system for the whole block, rendering the cantilevered boiler house redundant. This meant that they had to partition off part of the entrance hall for the new electrical intake gear and then introduce a dropped ceiling over the hall, hiding the top of the coloured glass screen and the coffered ceiling in order to provide a route for the new cables to get across. There is a small possibility that we may be able to reroute the cables and remove the dropped ceiling even this year. It was supposed to happen 2 years ago. Once you get up the tower, you get into the lift lobbies, bottom left, which, as I say, are 1.5 stories high, with grand coffered ceilings and the dramatic hit-and-miss pattern of the slit windows. The ceramic tiles are a different colour for each floor to identify them. On the left you see the pattern formed by the slit windows and daywork joints, this time on the side of the circulation tower with the cantilevered and now redundant boiler house above, whose windows were originally painted black and were quite recently returned to that colour as a result of my intervention, but since, at the same time, the timber boarding backing the balconies was stained an inappropriate dark chocolate brown, the original colour composition has yet to be recovered. In the sun, like that, the concrete looks beautiful with its radiused corners. On the right is a sectional drawing showing how the staircases going up and down from the access galleries interlock with one another. Goldfinger presented this to the Royal Academy as his diploma work when elected a member. These magnificent drawings were produced with assistance by Goldfinger between 1975, when I left his office, and 1977, when he closed it, aged 75. They show the in situ crosswall structure and the precast elements of the railway carriage-like access galleries and balconies, and the cornice spatially enriching and demarcating the skyline, long since. As the French critic Joseph Abrams said, they contain, quote, tout son apport doctrinal, all his theoretical contribution. He had nothing else by then to do. The GLC, with a contracting housing programme, and Hubert Bennett having departed, had ceased to give work out, and Goldfinger was no longer any use to developers to obtain planning permissions. He had been narrowly unsuccessful with his scheme for Hammerson's to rebuild the south side of Bloomsbury Square, and the tide had definitely turned against him and his approach. These are the secondary buildings on the Cheltenham estate. The building on the left edge of the left image was the podium for the tower, 3 stories of client-demanded but unused parking with a landscaped roof. It was demolished about 25 years ago, and there's been a muddy hole there ever since. Kensington Chelsea Council, to whom the estate was passed following the abolition of the GLC, now wants to build noddy houses there. An exaggeration. There has been an ongoing battle for at least the last 15 years about what should be built there. I believe the podium should be rebuilt as it was, but divided into 2 stories rather than 3, and serving a variety of possible purposes, restoring with its landscaped roof the original green heart of the estate and the coherence of its design. Beyond is one of the 6-storey blocks of old people's flats. On the right is a view of some of the terrace housing, where it climbs up the gradient in picturesque fashion, with wonderfully elegant windows and heavily emphasised cross walls. They have all now been listed, but after most of them have lost their original windows and been altered in various ways. They were being built while I worked in Goldfinger's office, which he had moved into from Piccadilly, into an unused proposed pub at the south end of Block B of Trellick Tower, on insalubrious Goldbourne Road. It was important to him to live and work in his own design, but professionally perhaps not a wise decision. More detailed images of Trellick, the soaring sense of scale on the right, and on the left the sense of space, is exciting, looking between those bridges, an example of how Goldfinger, by attention to the humdrum requirements of the brief, could provide a source of architectural invention. The circulation tower is remote from the main block, perhaps originally simply to allow the refuse collection vehicles to pass right round it. In a sense, that was true of his housing design as a whole. He embraced the Parker Morris standards and the humdrum briefs to which he adhered exactly, and made something magical out of them. This was Goldfinger's last house design, the Perry House at Windlesham in Surrey, designed at about the same time as Trellick. Its 2 timber-faced, timber-built pavilions linked by a conservatory. He sited it at the highest point on the large, steeply contoured, well-treed site, so that you get distant views, just as you get distant views from the flats of his towers, even though this called for the construction of a considerable length of twisting roadway to reach it, which must have been expensive. There it is in the pine woods. I find these cruciform columns supporting the beams are an extraordinarily monumental way of using wood. Somehow it gives it a monumental weight. It's not a folksy use of wood, shall we say. The deep timber beams span the full width of the house, supporting a structural timber deck that is also exposed internally. The historian Peter Collins detected an affinity between concrete and timber structure in Perret's work due to the formwork, and here is perhaps a manifestation of it in Goldfinger's work. The columns are at 8 foot 3 inch centres, 3 times the canonical 2 foot 9 inch module, and the ceiling height is also 8 foot 3. So the bays are square in section, except at the northern end of the house, where Raum plan, like The floor steps down following the contours of the site, giving the living room and study a higher ceiling. So, with the sense of space engendered by its elevation and the stepped floor, its expressed timber structure and its modular proportions, this house does indeed exhibit the three aspects of Goldfinger's work on which I said I would focus at the start of this talk. Sometimes I've wondered whether the phrase that Samuel Johnson used about Milton, that he could cut a colossus from a rock but not carve heads upon cherry stones, was true of Goldfinger. I don't think it was. The big buildings have huge impact. See Trellick, top left, and Alexander Fleming House, top right. But he could design beautifully little things as well, such as the door handle below, used throughout Alexander Fleming House, whose soft form responds to the human touch. The details, however, were always subordinated to the overall effect. So I propose to end this talk as Charlotte Perriand did her introduction to the catalogue of the 1983 Architectural Goldfinger exhibition. Bravo, Erno!